She didn't look up when she slid the termination papers across the desk, just kept her eyes on her tablet, stylus tapping softly, as if the decision she'd made was so mundane it barely required acknowledgement. The silence in the room felt manufactured, premeditated, the kind you engineer when you don't want to deal with what you've done. "Your mentorship was valuable," she said, her tone flat, like she was reading off a script. "For a different era." The phrase didn't sting. It echoed. "My name is Henry Lowell. I'm 56 years old, and until 3 hours ago, I was Senior Systems Director at Ascalon Dynamics, a firm I helped build when it was still renting space above a laundromat in Columbus. Back then, we had 6 employees, 2 working laptops, and a whiteboard full of ideas that were half brilliance, half madness. We built scheduling software for logistics firms, unglamorous, underfunded, and desperately needed. Within 10 years, we were processing fleet data for 3 Fortune hundreds. Within 20, we'd absorbed 2 competitors and went public. I spent 31 years in that building, trained 7 directors, mentored 11, helped onboard 3 of the current board members when they were still too green to send an email without BCCing the CEO by accident. I wasn't the loudest in the room. I never wanted to be. But I was the one they called when things broke. I didn't give speeches. I gave solutions. And now here I was, seated across from a woman named Sierra Wynn, 25 years old, newly minted from a coastal MBA program, hired as part of a transformational leadership pivot, championed by the board's newest member. She was the kind of executive whose LinkedIn bio uses verbs like spearheaded and disrupted without irony. She had clean teeth, sharp cheekbones, and a voice like a TED Talk playing at half volume. Sierra never looked at me like a person. I was a bullet point to be struck through. She tapped her stylus again and said, "You'll be receiving a 3-month severance and continued medical through the end of the quarter. Please don't feel pressured to stay and clean out your desk. We'll coordinate courier services for anything you need." I nodded. Not out of agreement, but recognition. The move was already complete. This wasn't a conversation. It was a chore she needed to finish before her next Slack stand-up. I scanned her posture, upright, symmetrical, unbothered. Her fingers curled slightly around the tablet, but there was no tension in them. She'd rehearsed this, rehearsed me. I reached across the desk and took the papers. No trembling, no comment. Just a smooth lift, fold and slide into the leather folio I'd carried since 1999. It still had the initials of our original company name stitched inside. She wouldn't recognize it. When I stood, she finally looked up, briefly, just enough to offer a professional half-smile that didn't reach her eyes. I extended my hand. She took it, firmly but quickly, like touching legacy systems too long might leave a mark. And I smiled, because what she didn't know, what the entire room didn't know, was that the very infrastructure her fresh leadership was built on ran through systems I designed, patched, and, in more than one case, protected behind backdoor redundancies no one bothered to audit after the last CTO retired. She thought she was cleaning house. She didn't realize I'd built the plumbing, wired the fuse box, and still held the blueprint for every silent failure waiting to happen. I walked past reception. No goodbyes. The younger staff glanced up with curious, distracted looks, then returned to their monitors. Probably assumed I was just another casualty of efficiency. They weren't wrong. Not in the short term. The elevator ride down was silent. 11 floors, 41 seconds. Long enough to remember the first time I'd stepped in here, holding a box of punch cards and a peanut butter sandwich, back when our security system was a clipboard and a guy named Ron who once got distracted by a squirrel and let a burglar in. I stepped out into the parking garage. My badge still worked. The red light didn't even blink. Another oversight, another assumption. I got into my car, started the engine, and sat there for a full minute before shifting into gear. No rage, no sadness, no panic. Just that strange, weightless feeling you get when something enormous ends without making a sound. She thought I'd go quietly. She thought I was done. I shook her hand, smiled, and walked out. But I never left. I didn't go home to mourn. I went home to plug in. The drive back was quiet, except for the familiar grind of that loose bearing in the rear left wheel. A rattle I'd never fixed, because it reminded me I was still moving. I kept my badge in the console, my phone off. Windows cracked just enough to feel the air shift around me like pressure fronts before a storm. My house sits at the end of a dead-end street, in a neighborhood where nothing ever happens, and everyone waves while keeping their distance. Built it myself, 16 years ago. Modest shell above ground, reinforced skeleton beneath. The office most people see is a converted den with old awards, a fake ficus, and a monitor that hasn't been plugged in since 2012. The real room is downstairs, through a back hall closet with a false wall, behind what looks like a panel of exposed plumbing. You press 2 knuckles to the copper elbow joint and lean in with your weight. If you do it right, you hear a soft click. If you don't, nothing happens. Most guests assume it's just bad construction. I never correct them. Inside, 12 by 12, grounded steel, EMF shielding woven into the studs, air-cooled backup generator, dual fiber lines rerouted through a silent junction in my neighbor's garden shed. 4 monitors, 3 redundant drives, a blacked-out NUC cluster mounted to the wall, blinking quietly like a sleeping heart. It's not impressive by modern standards, but it's mine. And more importantly, it's invisible. I sat down, keyed in the sequence. The chair groaned like it always did. That sounds a comfort. The startup screen flickered, then stabilized. I loaded into my diagnostic environment, a shell OS I wrote a decade ago under the name Opal Fox. It has no brand markers, no file extensions anyone would recognize. It reads like corrupted junk to anyone not trained to parse hexadecimal structure by hand. I logged in, using an admin credential created in 2007. It was buried 3 levels deep under a dummy account we once used for load testing our first customer-facing dashboard. The account had no usage in the audit logs since before our IPO. No one remembered it existed, and even if they did, they wouldn't know the second factor was stored on a physical USB key welded into a soldered bay on the back of my router. The system accepted the handshake. I was in. I watched the admin console load. Packet requests, ping reports, task queues, everything alive, everything chattering. The same company that had just severed me at the knees was still running on the legs I built. I opened a shell prompt and started querying internal broadcast logs. My monitoring suite ran silently, built to mimic cache indexing behavior, so any intrusion detection system would see it as harmless overhead. Within seconds, I saw the pulse. 6 campaign nodes had pushed out a new media package overnight. PR package, internal communications, shareholder narrative. I opened the payload archive. There it was. Culture shift, leadership for a new era. The second slide hit harder than the first. There, in pale blue Helvetica over a blurred background of city skylines and latte foam, was a bullet point. Sunsetting legacy roles, operational transition through strategic renewal. I knew what it meant before I clicked deeper, but I had to see it anyway. A photo of me. Cropped tight. Unflattering. Pulled from the internal portal I helped design. Captioned, "After 31 years of exemplary service, Henry Lowell has chosen to step away from Ascalon Dynamics as part of our continued mission to evolve." I hadn't chosen anything. They'd already run the press release. The timestamp was 90 minutes after I walked out. They didn't even wait for the courier to call about my desk. I moved deeper into the logs, tracing the asset metadata. The video campaign was tagged to Sierra's internal ID, not outsourced, not delegated. She built it herself. Likely wanted to showcase her initiative to the board, frame my erasure as her first decisive move. She thought it would earn her trust. She didn't know she was uploading it into a system I'd hardwired with recursive journaling. Every asset she touched, every line of copy she edited, every timestamp, every authorization request, all of it had been shadow-logged, every breadcrumb still warm. I sat back and looked at the swirling data cascade across the third monitor. The very air felt heavier now, not with anger, not with grief, with presence. I was inside the system like a surgeon with no audience, like a ghost still holding the scalpel. She thought my systems were just old scaffolding, that the company could gut the foundation and still host a gala in the penthouse. But this company doesn't run on shiny dashboards and performance decks. It runs on code that never got cleaned up because it worked. On batch jobs no one touches because they're afraid of breaking something they don't understand. On integrations still held together by scripts I wrote on weekends in 2010 using syntax nobody uses anymore. And I never stopped logging, never stopped patching, never stopped watching. She thinks this was a handoff, a symbolic pivot, a farewell. But what she doesn't realize is, I am the system. They wanted a new era. I gave them one. I didn't need to break in. I was already inside. The VM I booted ran silently in the background, nestled deep inside the asset registry cluster labeled Q4 Redundancy Testing Suite, an innocuous title no one had questioned in 4 years. It pulled system activity in real time, keystrokes, screen captures, shared drives, and anything marked with executive-level permissions. I'd originally designed it as a compliance layer, after a contractor leaked early code to a competitor. The official version had limited visibility. The one I kept for myself did not. The first thing I checked was the compensation logs. Sierra's name appeared 17 times across a rolling 3-month payout cycle. Nothing overtly criminal. On the surface, everything passed muster. But when I started matching timestamps against OKR completions, the discrepancies started humming like a loose wire. Bonuses tied to deliverables that had never cleared QA. Budget shifts that had no matching proposals. Marketing incentives issued before campaigns launched. I mapped the activity to a Gantt-style overlay, added color coding for reporting trails, and the pattern snapped into view. She was backdating progress, fabricating performance thresholds, building the illusion of velocity. Worse, she was padding her team's visibility reports with content I knew hadn't originated in her division. I dug into the internal asset vault, the project folders marked cross-functional innovation. These were supposed to be shared resources, white papers, use case demos, UX research. I recognized entire sections, lifted straight from a documentation set I'd written myself during the second revision of our logistics interface. Her name had been appended to the metadata as primary reviewer, which in corporate speak gets read as creator if you smile the right way in a board meeting. It wasn't the first time she'd done it. 6 months ago, her department was floundering in a competitive bid for an automation contract with Stratavault Freight. I'd stepped in late one night after her lead engineer begged me for help. rewrote their system hooks from scratch to integrate with our legacy fleet modules, which got them under budget and past spec. The contract closed 3 days later. I watched her present the final deck to the board. My code, my architecture, her smile. I didn't call her out. I told myself it was politics. Let the new blood win one. Stay behind the curtain, where I was used to standing. But now, looking at the audit trails, I realized that was the first move on a board I hadn't realized we were playing. I opened the Slack mirrors next. The Ghost VM had been feeding transcripts into my private archive since its first boot. Not every conversation, just ones flagged with keywords I'd set manually. Redirect, merge, transition, legacy, pilot. The kind of words people use when they're prepping a knife for someone else's back. One thread stood out. A private channel titled Number Skunkworks Elevate. No invite log, no audit trail. That meant she'd gone through the back door using admin tools. Only people who knew how the architecture worked could have hidden something like that. There were 8 members, mostly strategy staff. One venture consultant I didn't recognize, but the domain on his Slack ID was a known VC firm out of Austin. The conversation thread was blunt. Sierra had pitched a spin-out. She called it a post-ops architecture accelerator, aimed at enterprise logistics firms still running on outdated back-end scaffolding. Her exact words, "We package the solution as clean UX on top of monolithic systems, basically give them the illusion of transformation without actual rebuild." The consultant had replied with fire emojis and asked if they could get to MVP within 4 months. She promised him a working prototype in 2. What she didn't mention was that the back-end scaffolding she was referring to was proprietary to Ascalon. What she didn't know was that the metrics she planned to show him, the performance benchmarks, the efficiency deltas, the diagnostic overlays, were generated using tools that didn't exist outside of my personal sandbox. They weren't just internal. They were mine, not licensed, not documented, not replicated. I pulled the repo logs. Her device had copied a folder from my drive 3 days before my termination. The timestamp aligned with her quick sync with the CTO, where she claimed she was gathering materials for the culture campaign. She wasn't just stealing credit. She was stealing product, the kind of product that, if packaged wrong, would breach 2 NDAs, trigger litigation with our freight partners, and crater investor confidence within 24 hours. And the board had no idea. They thought she was scaling innovation. They thought she was leading a renaissance. They didn't realize they were watching a magician. Sleight of hand, mirrors, and noise. I watched the last screen capture from her laptop, her cursor hovering over a slide titled Legacy Systems as Obsolescence Narrative. She highlighted a line in yellow, "Don't fight the tide. Build the new shore." Then she pasted a note to herself. Need better quote. Henry said something once about scaffolding versus foundation. I sat back in the chair and let the screen fade to black. Not from inactivity, just for a moment, just to breathe. They thought they were playing chess. I built the board. The atrium buzzed with artificial warmth, spotlights overhead, hors d'oeuvres plated like art projects, wine circulating faster than the budget approvals ever had. They'd transformed the lower campus into something that resembled ambition. Clear glass panels reflected the movement of people more than the people themselves. Everything gleamed. Everything echoed. That's how you know it's staged. They called it the Ascalon Elevation Gala, a rebranding celebration, a future-facing relaunch of strategy, culture, and vision. The company's internal invites called it a signal to the market that legacy was over, and leadership had arrived. I'd been legacy. I'd also been the one who designed the access protocols that still, apparently, recognized me. When I walked past the security gates, the badge I'd cloned the night before chirped green without so much as a second look. The guard glanced up, nodded out of muscle memory, then went back to scrolling through his phone. I moved through the crowd the way I always had, without friction. It was easier than it should have been. The staff that used to defer to me were gone, replaced by smiles I didn't recognize and buzzwords that flew like confetti. Everyone here was polished. No one here had ever rebooted a server with a paperclip and a prayer. I passed clusters of interns quoting lines from the CEO's welcome speech as if they were scripture. I passed the board's liaison shaking hands like she had a quota, and I passed a digital display running a slideshow on loop, the one that had glitched for exactly 0.7 seconds earlier that afternoon. No one had noticed. They thought it was buffering. They didn't know I'd been testing injection points. The glitch wasn't a bug, it was a probe, a successful one. I slipped into the second-floor restroom, checked the stalls, then turned to face the mirror. My tie was a half Windsor, slightly crooked. I adjusted it by instinct, not vanity. From my pocket, I pulled the USB drive, matte black, unmarked, loaded with a scheduled payload, and a dead man trigger linked to an off-site signal repeater tucked inside a smart humidifier at a co-working space across town. It was crude insurance, the kind you keep for people who don't believe in consequences until they're breathing them in. The file structure was elegant, a master index file linking evidence tags to metadata snapshots, Slack threads, Zoom recordings, file timestamps, duplicated drive logs with hashes matched to internal dev servers. Every piece of Sierra's manipulation cataloged and timestamped, matched against known deliverables and external communications. Every stolen line of code, every plagiarized white paper, every falsified OKR report with her name stamped into the metadata, like she thought the system wouldn't keep receipts. The injections were queued. Launch was scheduled for 8:57 a.m. the following morning. Board inboxes, regulatory BCCS, investor relations nodes, 3 press contacts who'd been trying to crack our internal stack for 2 years, but couldn't get past the outer firewall. They wouldn't have to. I was opening the gates. In the mirror, I didn't look like revenge. I looked like payroll. 46 regulars, clean shave, pressed collar. But my hands moved like they remembered something colder. I slipped the drive back into the inner pocket, locked the dead man to the failover node, and left without flushing a sink. Downstairs, champagne flutes clinked, like they were trying to drown out the future. The lights dimmed. The crowd shifted. A spotlight bloomed on stage, and there she was. Sierra Wynn. 25 years old, flawless posture, tailored slate suit over a silk blouse like it meant something. She smiled with teeth made for magazine covers and raised a hand like she was conjuring silence. It worked. The room hushed. She spoke in a cadence someone had clearly coached her into. Slow, measured, pregnant, with implied wisdom. "Tonight isn't about where we've been," she said. "It's about where we're going. We stand on the threshold of a new operational paradigm, one that respects the past but refuses to be confined by it." They clapped. The kind of clap that people do when they want to prove they understand the mood. I watched her eyes move across the room, and when they passed over me, she didn't stop, didn't pause. She didn't recognize me in this lighting, in this crowd, in this moment. She had already rewritten me in her mind as a solved variable. I watched her click through slides, talking points wrapped in animated transitions. Half of them were repurposed from confidential ops reports I authored 5 years ago. Benchmarks that were never meant to be public. Forecast graphs that had caveats ripped out for visual clarity. Strategies I developed during a blackout week in the second quarter of 2019, while her team was still getting lost in Jira tickets. The crowd swallowed every word, and she glowed in the spotlight like the future had already crowned her. I took a single step backward, then another. My fingers brushed the inside of my jacket, just to feel the drive one more time. Just to confirm it was real. Then I made my way to the far exit, nodding to a janitor wheeling an empty cart toward the east stairwell. I didn't break stride, just leaned in slightly as we passed and said, "Might want to clear your inbox before 9 a.m. He blinked, didn't reply. He wouldn't understand until the morning. By then, neither would she. At 8:57 a.m., the inboxes lit up. I'd watched the mail servers begin to pulse from the comfort of a quiet cafe 6 blocks away. Just me, a lukewarm black coffee, and the silent hum of consequence threading its way through fiber lines. The payload deployed clean. No bounce backs, no flags, no failures. The files were compressed and marked with nothing flashier than the title: Operational Audit, Confidential Review. The kind of label no executive ignores, the kind they open while holding their breath. By 9:04, the first phone call hit the Ascalon front desk. It came from a client who recognized their proprietary metrics inside Sierra's stolen prototype. They wanted to know why their confidentiality agreement had been violated, and why they hadn't been informed that the company was repackaging their data for outside investors. They used the word lawsuit before the receptionist could finish saying, "Please hold." By 9:21, the board had convened a closed-door emergency session. The calendar entry was masked with a generic strategic alignment briefing, but I still had ghost access to the meeting invite log. The subject line had been changed mid-click. It now read, "Critical Exposure, Internal Escalation." At 9:34, Sierra Wynn walked into the conference room in heels that echoed a little too loudly. She looked like confidence painted onto glass. Perfect hair, tailored blazer, that same subtle half-smile she always wore when she knew cameras were nearby. Except this time, the only camera was behind her, pointed at a screen she didn't know was already halfway through her eulogy. The projection came from someone else's laptop. It played her own voice back to her, surgically selected from the Slack thread she thought she'd buried. Legacy staff just don't get innovation, but we keep them around for optics. There was no context that could save it, not when paired with the metadata trail showing her editing timestamps on OKRs, not when the client reports showed performance deltas that didn't exist, not when the white papers bore her name but were written by people she had never spoken to, not when the source code she'd promised to investors matched 86% byte for byte with back-end tools still under Ascalon's IP lock. She tried to spin. I watched it happen in real time, through a silent feed piped into my private server from a parabolic mic stationed across the street. "We've been experimenting with new packaging language," she said. "Some of these reports were early drafts, internal framing only." But the room didn't believe her, not when every early draft had her initials in the version history. Not when one board member, the same man I trained 15 years ago, interrupted her to ask why she'd backdated 4 financials using his login credentials. She started to sweat then. It was visible, small at first, just a shift in her shoulders, a glance toward the exit, a slight shake as she reached for her water. And then came the silence. The kind that settles when a room realizes it's been conned. Not a loud collapse, just the hiss of air leaving a balloon that never should have floated. HR entered without a word. A quiet nod. A folder. She froze. They walked her out without ceremony. No applause, no handshake, no dignity. I watched her exit from across the street, leaning against a rusted bus stop that hadn't served its route in years. The wind picked up just enough to move her hair, but she didn't fix it. Her steps faltered as they passed the lobby glass. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked small. They called me obsolete, but the foundation never forgets. I didn't go inside, didn't need to. I walked the opposite direction, down a street I'd mapped years ago when the city hadn't yet named it. Past the rows of buildings I once helped fund, the code I once wrote in the margins of invoices, the structure I helped stand up when the company didn't even have a front desk. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. And I wasn't proud either. Just finished. Betrayal doesn't come with alarms. It arrives in your inbox dressed in flattery. It shakes your hand and thanks you for your time. It tells you you're part of something special, while quietly measuring your absence. And destruction, real destruction, never starts with shouting. It begins with deletion, a file here, a credential there. Then, one day, you blink, and your name is gone from the wall. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about remembering who built the walls they danced inside. I won't consult again. Not soon. Maybe not ever. There's a quiet somewhere I've been saving. A place without Wi-Fi, where the stars still look like pinholes punched through black velvet. I'll go there. Rest a while. Write things down the old way. By hand. Ink, paper, truth. She wanted to lead a revolution. She forgot who trained the rebels.